You can go ahead and have a seat. And if you have a Bible, you can open that up to Matthew chapter 5, where we're going to be continuing on in our series on the Sermon on the Mount in this wonderful topic, a quite difficult one of lust and divorce. And so we're going to be looking at some things this morning that I quite rather would have wished Pastor Ben would have been here to do, but he's conveniently out of town, enjoying vacation with his family, so blessings on them. And I have the joyful, difficult responsibility of preaching this passage. So let's look at Matthew chapter 5, starting verse 27. You have heard it that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. These words are often quite difficult to preach on, not because they're difficult to understand, because they're quite clear, and yet applying them is difficult to figure out. Learning what does this mean for us, that's the difficult part because it so often will cut to the heart the way Jesus' words does throughout this whole sermon. You know, I was thinking about it, and I kind of liken what Jesus is saying here to this universal concept that kids understand when they're young of cooties. Maybe not in the way that you're thinking right now, but I just kind of think cooties is a game that kids always play. I don't know, I was reading an article once where this person was saying, why is it that every kid, they don't need to be taught about cooties, they just kind of know when you play the game. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that old song, circle, circle, dot, dot. Now I have my cootie shot. And it was understood for kids, when you have cooties, you run away from everyone else who does. There was a sense of uncleanness or dirtiness or shame over those who had it. And who knows what they are? Kids, go and take it up with your parents and ask them what they are, because I still don't know to this day. But when it comes to the matters of sexuality, sexual sin, divorce, adultery, I think these are almost universally understood that there's something shameful and wrong and broken when it comes to those matters. Now, there's varying degrees of brokenness and levels of shame around it, especially as our culture continues to rewrite what is shameful or acceptable in sexual relationships. But these are ideas that are almost universal, where when we approach them, there's always a sense of caution. There's not much that has to be said other than we know that there's something wrong, especially when it comes to matters of adultery and divorce. And so for this morning, I want us to look at, through this passage, to simply ask the question, as we're in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is revealing the kingdom of God, who he is as king, and what the kingdom of God says about these matters of life. Well, what does the kingdom of God have to say about matters of sex and sexuality? How should we think about and approach sex, sexual sin, adultery, marriage, and divorce? Now, I know there's lots of young ones in here, so I'm going to try to keep this as PG as possible, but we also want to attack things head on the way Jesus did. We don't want to shy away from topics that Jesus was not shy about. And so parents, we've done our best to try to set you up well and send out some resources to do some follow-up conversations with your kids. But kids, also, if you're in the service, I hope that even if some of these concepts are new for you, the good news is that if kids are learning this in the church, we get to set the grounds and the foundation upon which they learn about sex and sexuality. And that's a good thing. We would rather them be exposed to these things in the church than out in the world or through social media. And so with that, how do we think about and approach sexual sin, marriage, and divorce? First, Jesus reveals there's a seriousness about sexual sin. Sexual sin is serious, and lust is serious. If you look again at verse 27, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. We get a similar format throughout here and last week and throughout the passages to come, where Jesus will attack some law or misunderstanding of the law, really, from the Old Testament that the Jews had, and reveal to them, as Pastor Ben mentioned last week, the intent or the heart that God desired behind it. And so much the way that last week we looked at anger, how Jesus says, you shall not murder, but really, even if you are angry towards someone, you've murdered in your heart. You've carried out, you've transgressed the heart of the law. Jesus does a similar thing here where his desire is not simply the outward physical act of adultery, but to prohibit even the inward adultery of the heart. It's an intensification of the law, so to speak. And what I've come to find is whenever we get to these words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, because they're so intense, they're so severe, it often brings up these questions of, yeah, but. Pastor Ben mentioned that last week, the whole idea of unrighteous anger versus holy anger. When we talk about things like this, there's often this, yeah, but, what if I accidentally look at a woman lustfully? It wasn't my fault, it just happened. We try to make these exceptions to give us some leeway or some room. And I think when we start with that question with the yeah, buts or the exceptions, we're asking the wrong question. See, Jesus presents it the way he does because he wants them to see that the question is not how far can we go before we sin. That's exactly the question the Pharisees were seeking to answer. When they would set up laws around their laws to try to keep the law, they were often asking the question, how far can we go without transgressing or breaking the law? Whereas Jesus is saying that's the wrong question. The better or the right question is not how far can we go until it's sin, but how far can we pursue God in his holiness? That's the purpose for Jesus here in this law and the seriousness of sin. He even in his language combines the 7th commandment that says, do not commit adultery, with the 10th commandment that says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house or your neighbor's wife. And what's interesting is in the Septuagint, or the Greek rendering of Exodus 20, verse 17, the very first thing mentioned is you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, not his house. And the word for covet is the very same word that Jesus uses here for lust, epithumia, to lust or desire after. And so in using this language, Jesus is bringing in a fuller sense the combination of these two commands to reveal his intent behind the law. How far can we go to pursue holiness? Now before we get into too much of this, there is, I think, this interpretive question we have to answer or ask, and that's why does Jesus focus only on men? And if you notice that, he says, I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery. He'll do this again later when he talks about divorce. And there's often a question of, is Jesus singling out, he's writing off women, he's being chauvinistic, he's in a male-dominant society, and he's acknowledging it. Well, I think actually Jesus is doing the quite opposite. Now, this isn't to say that women don't struggle with lust. I think it's a common misconception, especially in conservative circles. We may say something like, men struggle with lust, women struggle with gossip or envy. Those are the only two categories you fall under. That's not the case. I think there are women that struggle with lust, and we shouldn't stigmatize them any more than we should stigmatize men. There's some equity in sin here for both the genders. But I think that's kind of Jesus' point in singling out the men, is recognizing men are often the problem of sexual sin and lust. This was certainly the case back then in Jesus' day. The common idea, it was commonplace to believe that men could have as many sexual partners as they wanted, and women were to be devoted and chaste only to their one husband. And anything else, the woman was to be condemned or stoned to death, but men could get off because it was just assumed men can't control their desires. They should have as many women as they want. By focusing on men, Jesus is attacking the heart of the problem that was residing in their society, but also the heart of the problem with lust, that it was often men who rose up and abused and used women for their own lust and pleasure. We get one very clear instance of this in John chapter 8, when the Jews bring a woman caught in adultery and they ask her, they ask Jesus, the law says we should stone her, what should we do? The question often there is, well, where's the other party of the person that committed adultery with her? Where's the man? He's nowhere to be found. That was commonplace in their culture. And this is more of a side point, but I do think embedded in here and what Jesus is focusing on is upholding the sanctity and sacredness of sex and marriage. And in doing so, he was guarding and protecting those who are vulnerable and abused in Jewish society. He was bringing equity for both genders and dignity to women. And that's just a side point that I think we should acknowledge whenever it comes to discussion on sexual sin and the seriousness of it. There's a very real vulnerability and abuse to women and children in our society that Jesus and his kingdom desires to protect and to guard. This is why we want to care about this at a church. It's why we set up the Caring Well team and why we want to be better about protecting the vulnerable, especially when it comes to sexual sin and abuse. But part of the problem with Jesus' words, again, like I mentioned, it's not that it's hard to understand. It's that it's so intense, we don't know how to apply it, how to live and abide by it. I think part of the problem for us in our society is that we've just become so numb to our sexualized world. It's pretty hard these days to turn anywhere in media or the internet or social media without being confronted with some sexual messages, whether it's simply watching TV during the Super Bowl and some L'Oreal commercial comes up, or whether it's going on social media and seeing often the fetishized or sexualized accounts on there, or spam accounts even that message you for a good time. Wherever we turn, it's hard to find a place in entertainment and society today where sex is not glorified. It's a very image-driven, sexualized world. It's common for shows and movies to depict sex scenes even when it has nothing to do with the storyline. You ever notice that? It has nothing to do, but for whatever reason, they feel the need to put this in. I mentioned before, I'm a big fan of the Marvel movies, the MCU. One of the reasons I've loved the movie so much is because they're generally family-friendly. Now, that all changed when the movie The Eternals came out. If you don't know the movie, don't worry, it was a bad movie anyways. Outside of it just being a bad movie, it was the first Marvel movie that actually depicted a sex scene. And there was all this uproar of how can Marvel do that? And some of the movie critics said, finally, Marvel's grown up. Remember one headline said that. Because that's what our culture glorifies and longs because we're living in a sexualized world. Which means then pursuing Jesus' words here may present some challenges, but I think maybe not necessarily much more than his own day and age did. Like I mentioned, it was commonplace for men to have multiple sexual partners. It was common in the Greco-Roman world for there to be images and statues depicted of naked women and men. It was common for men to seek out cult prostitutes at the temples of the gods they worshiped. They also lived in a sexualized world, and we shouldn't think that, our world is so much harder, so we don't have to take Jesus' words as seriously. That's not the point. Again, the point is, how far can we pursue Jesus' holiness, his kingdom holiness in this area of sex and sexuality? And I do want to give a specific word to all the young people in this room. Whether you're a teenager or you're a young person on the cusp of your teens and tweens, or you're just a little kid, you're growing up in a world that is bombarding you with images of sex and sexuality. Likely you've heard at one time or another, or you will hear sometime soon, that sexual freedom and liberty is the road to happiness and fulfillment. That's the large agenda of our culture today. This is why you have the culture wars centering on gender, sexuality, non-binary issues. Because our world has led us to believe that the more liberty and freedom we have in sexuality, the more fulfilled we will be. So pursue all your sexual desires. Do what you please. It's your body. Do with it what you want. There's some interesting statistics that have come out recently from this organization called Common Sense Media that's devoted to caring for young people's minds around social media and the internet. And in this study from 2022, just the end of last year, it was released in October, I believe, they said that the average exposure to pornography is the age of 12 now, because it's just the access that kids have. By the age of 13, 54% of all teens will have seen porn in some way, and 73% of all teens today have seen pornographic images, either accidentally or on purpose. And that's a very real reality that may frighten and terrify us as parents when we think about raising our kids in this world. But one of the questions we have to ask is, how do Jesus' words apply and combat that? I think something that's really interesting is even though our culture has this somewhat universal belief that everyone should pursue their own sexual desires as they please, there still seems to be some sense where kids should be guarded from that. Even this non-Christian author, one of my favorite books on this topic called American Girls, by Nancy Jo Sales, written in 2014. She's a journalist for Vogue. She wrote in this book recounting how social media and a sexualized social media world have been affecting young teens, especially young women today. And by the end of her book, she comes to this conclusion. Remember, she's not a Christian, where she says that to simply throw our kids into social media and say to explore your sexuality, enjoy yourself, do what you want, it's harming kids more than helping them. And even as a feminist, something that she writes is, well, it's not such a feminist message to say that women should just express their bodies when they're continually still subject unto the male gaze and male abuse on social media. She recognizes that there's something inherently wrong with the sexual message of our culture today. And if you even just think about the purpose behind the message our culture gives, often it's to give us the sense of liberty and freedom, but really at the heart of it is it's fulfillment, it's satisfaction, it's contentment. And yet, what does Jesus lay out in his Sermon on the Mount? From the very beginning, we're told that these are the blessed people. Pastor Ben mentioned that blessed could be seen as to be happy, to be fulfilled, to have a life prospering and living in Christ. And all that comes after is Jesus unfolding what it looks like to live the blessed life. And one of the ways that we live the blessed life, it's not in sexual liberty or fulfillment, but it's actually in sexual restraint, living within the bounds and the design that God gave us with our sexuality. See, sexual sin and lust is in direct opposition to the blessed life that Jesus would have for us, that the kingdom of God promises to us, which means that lust and sexual sin, if we chase after them, can cause us to live opposed to Christ himself. See, sexual sin can cause us to stray from Christ. I think that's Jesus' next point. It continues in verse 29. It says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Whenever we see almost word for word the exact phrases repeated in Scripture, it's something to pay attention to. And by repeating himself twice, Jesus is essentially saying that to follow after this trail of sexual sin and lust, of adultery, of pornography, wherever our hearts go that are outside of the confines of marriage, it's as if we're throwing ourselves into hell. It's causing us to be thrown into hell. Now, I think this could indicate the sharp distinction that Jesus is laying down, where he says that those who are in the kingdom of God shall not have any hint or trace of sexual sin in them. Which begs the question then, if we are so characterized by sexual sin that we're not even fighting, I don't think Jesus is saying that even if you have one small ounce of lust, you will go into the gates of hell. Now, we'll talk about that at the end, but I think rather, if there's no instance of fighting against it, of turning away and pursuing Christ, from what Jesus is saying, this may be an indication that you are not one of the blessed people living as salt and light as part of his kingdom. I think he is driving a sharp distinction by saying that those who are in the kingdom of God will not exhibit a devotion to lust and sexual sin. They'll go so far as to cut it off and throw it away. But I think Jesus might also be illustrating something else here. I think he might be illustrating the slow wandering away from the kingdom that happens when we give our affections to something else, even as we just sung. See, because when we give our affections to something other than Christ and his kingdom, we cause our hearts to be drawn after that thing, wandering away from Christ and his kingdom. To allow sexual sin and lust to go unchecked in our hearts and lives is to allow us to turn away from Christ and live a life opposed to him and wander after the things of the world. This is so often in my years as a pastor, especially in youth ministry, where I've seen people wander away from the faith. It starts with small compromises, the yeah, but exceptions. To say, well, yeah, but that doesn't really apply to me, or yeah, but I can just do it this one time. And the more the small compromises happen, the more someone's heart gets turned more and more away from Christ and onto the things of the world, seeking after the pleasures of the world rather than clinging on to the promises of Christ. It's the warning that Jesus gives. And I think we don't have to look that far to see examples of this even within the church. Even just the number of cases of sexual abuse by church and Christian leaders in the last few years alone that have been coming out is a sign of this, of how there have been Christian leaders and even just ordinary Christians who have been throwing away, as Jesus says, their lives and their ministries to pursue after sexual sin. It's a serious sin, which means it must be dealt with in severity. Jesus gives this really graphic image of how we deal with it. He says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out. The word is literally gouge it out and throw it away from you. If your hand causes you to sin, chop it off and throw it away from you. Really graphic, gruesome image. What does Jesus mean by that? There's been a lot of debate and speculation. What does he mean when he says gouge out your eye? Why the eye? Well, that seems pretty clear. It's with the eye that you see images that cause your heart to lust. So if your eye is causing that, gouge it out and throw it away. What about the hand? There's been some explanations, some more graphic than others that I don't need to repeat. But really the simple thing to note is that Jesus is focusing in on with the eyes where we have intent and the hands that connote the action or the doing of lust and adultery. Now, did Jesus mean this literally? If it was literal, well, we may have a lot of one-eyed people in the church. But to be honest, will gouging out one eye really stop you from seeing images and lusting? No, you'd have to gouge out both. And even then, once the images are seared in your brain, well, they're there forever. Will cutting off one hand really stop you from lusting in your hearts? See, Jesus' point was not to be quite literal. As much as some people have taken this, Origen, the famous Christian philosopher, took this literally and castrated himself to follow Jesus' words. But Jesus didn't mean this literally. There's no way he could have. If he did, then he would have been no different than arguing like the Pharisees, setting up laws as boundaries for the laws. Jesus' point is not to acknowledge or admit the righteousness of the Pharisees and what they were doing, but actually to show that it wasn't enough. And so I think what Jesus meant here is he's conveying the severity or the extreme nature we should take in combating sexual sin because of how pervasive it is, because of how much it embeds not just into the mind, but the heart, as Jesus says, because of how much it can distort our whole affections. See, our sexual desires and our sexual selves get to the root, honestly, of who we are many times. And so Jesus' words here are meant to convey how extreme we're to go in taking measures to fight lust and sexual sin. So what does he mean by it then? Well, John Stott, commenting on these verses, he says quite simply, if looking at something causes you to lust, don't look at it. If doing something causes you to lust, don't do that thing. Now, easier said than done. Thanks, John Stott, so helpful. But he goes on to say that while it may not guarantee victory or success, and this is not where it should stem from, at least setting up some boundary markers gives us some protections against sin. Philip Davis this morning with our youth mentioned Proverbs 25, that to go without self-control is to let a city go unguarded without walls. And that's in a sense what John Stott was saying. He says this in his commentary, the message on the Sermon on the Mount. He says, what is necessary for all those with strong sexual temptations, and indeed for all of us in principle, is discipline in guarding the approaches of sin. Are we so foolish as to allow the enemy to overwhelm us simply because we have posted no sentries to warn us of his approach? I think there's a lot of wisdom there. That if we don't even set up some guards or some walls, then we may allow Satan to infiltrate our hearts in ways that could simply just be filtered out through some simple measures. Now, this is not to lay down a new law. I think that would be to miss Jesus' point. Our point would be not to lay down new laws. Well, all the men, you need to do this. All the women, you need to dress like this. And then we'll go back to like a 1990s youth camp where everyone coming in the door has to measure their skirts down past their knees and stuff of the sort. That's not the point. The point is that if all of us have different tendencies and measures of lust or temptation after it, then we may all have different ways we need to apply Jesus' words. There may be different ways that we all need to approach this topic or this lust and temptation, and it may look different from person to person. I think for some, this may be as simple and easy as just cutting out certain avenues of lust, to the point where if we cut out enough, we may not be able to keep ourselves from lusting completely, but if we can starve our eyes of it, then we can reduce the temptation of lust from a blaring horn down to a faint voice. For myself, this is something that I've honestly struggled with for many years of my life. From a young age, came from a broken home, and so sex and sexuality was not something I was raised and taught with well in my family. And so it's something I've struggled with at varying levels in my own life. And so at times I've realized that maybe being weaker than some other people, there are just certain things that I can and can't do. For instance, when the hit show, HBO show, Game of Thrones came out, all my friends were telling me, you gotta watch Game of Thrones. I'm a big fantasy nerd. I'm a nerd, I'll own that. And so I thought to myself, yeah, Game of Thrones, this is right up my alley. But as I started seeing more and more Christian reviews coming out of how sexually explicit it was, I just made a decision and realized I don't think I can watch that. It won't be good for my heart. It's not to say other people can't, I just know my weaknesses. That's not a show that I can watch. That's something I've just had to learn to come to terms with. Certain shows, I either have to fast forward through parts or just can't watch them. For others, it may be as severe as cutting off the entirety of the source of lust itself, cutting out social media completely, internet, whatever the source may be. There may be times where we have to put up guardrails. But remember, the point is not for self-righteousness and piety like the Pharisees. The point is guarding our hearts, as Stott says, for what? For the purpose of pursuing and treasuring Christ, so that we might taste and see how good he is compared to the world. That's the purpose and the point. See, this is set within the context of Jesus extolling and giving direction about him and his kingdom. And so for all those that are in his kingdom, our desire should be setting our affections on Christ and his kingdom. Which means that in our second point, brings us to our second point, Jesus establishes the sacredness of marriage and sex. Sexual sin is serious, but there's a greater vision that he gives us, and that's the sacredness of marriage and sex. Sex has a proper place. Jesus is not trying to give us some stoicism where we're not meant to enjoy sex at all. It's in its proper place. And Jesus acknowledges that when he talks about marriage and divorce right after this. The proper place and enjoyment to see sex and pleasure as good is in the covenant commitment of marriage. And Jesus, I think, is affirming that. But that's why he goes on to address this other serious topic of marriage and divorce. Now, we're not going to talk a whole lot about it here because we'll revisit this in Matthew 19 when we get there, where Jesus talks on the very same issue. And what he reveals in Matthew 19 is he tells the Pharisees that divorce exists because of your misunderstanding of the law. Jesus cites this in verse 31. He says, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. This is a citation from Deuteronomy 24, where Moses is giving directions. If a man gives a certificate of divorce to a woman, he cannot then go and remarry her again if she's gone and married someone else, because that would be adultery. She's gone and married someone else. He can't take her back. And the Jews, unfortunately, took that as a sign that, well, Moses permitted divorce, so we can divorce on whatever grounds we want. Divorce had become so commonplace that men could divorce women for virtually whatever reason they want, from as extreme as finding their wives caught in adultery to as small as something that they no longer found favorable in their wife's eyes. One rabbi recounts a divorce that happened because his wife accidentally burned his food. That was the basis of the divorce. And what Jesus is doing is correcting their misunderstanding here. Now, right away, I think we should ask the question, why was divorce even permitted? Well, divorce was permitted to protect the women in Jewish society. Without a certificate of divorce, men could simply throw the women out of the house, not desire her anymore, and the woman would be left on her own without the protection or headship of a man. That was so often necessary in a patriarchal society. patriarchal society where the men provided provision and protection. For a woman to be without a household, whether under her father or brothers or husband, was to leave her vulnerable, both to others to be abused, but also simply to the provision and elements of the world in their agrarian society. And so divorce was really for the protection of the men, but it became an abuse. It was protection for the women, but became abused by the men. And so Jesus now, in attacking divorce, he goes after this issue to help them realize, or to reveal to them, that there's a sacredness of marriage that was meant to be held up higher than they were doing as Jews, where they were seeing divorce simply as another means of their own fulfillment. Jesus is revealing the sacredness of marriage and sex, and how marriage essentially lasts forever. Jesus gives one exception here, and that's except on the grounds of sexual immorality. What he's essentially saying is divorce in God's eyes, it does not exist unless the marriage has been broken through sexual immorality or adultery. But outside of that one instance, divorce doesn't exist in God's kingdom. So as much as they may go to courts or file for divorce, that marriage continues on forever. So then to go and remarry or have other relations with someone else was tantamount to adultery, is what Jesus is saying. Now I know there's lots of questions on this. Maybe questions about, well, what about this? Yeah, but the exceptions. There's a lot of sensitivity. I want to acknowledge that. There are other provisions for divorce that we actually see from Paul in 1 Corinthians. But again, the question and the goal should not be to argue from exceptions as much as we should take sensitivity around this. The goal, again, is pursuing holiness. And the reason comes from asking the question, why did God uphold marriage as so sacred? I think it's because marriage is about more than just us. In God's kingdom, marriage is about more than just us and our fulfillment and sexual desires. Neither sex nor marriage are means for our own pleasure or fulfillments. You know, if you just kind of think with the world, take the world's logic, our culture's logic today, about sexual freedom and fulfillment, that's the road to personal fulfillment. Sexual liberty, marriage, divorce, remarriage, do whatever you want to find love and pursue fulfillment. If that really is the road to actual love and fulfillment, then we should ask the question, does it stand? Does it actually work? And I've asked myself this question in the past, if that's really the case, well, who are the people in our culture that would seem to have the most success at this? Who are the people that would seem to have the best marriages because they can pursue anyone they want? They have the means to do so. Who are the ones that should have the most satisfying, fulfilling sexual relationships and marriages? It's celebrities. They're the most wealthy, the most talented, the most good looking. We often put them on a pedestal, don't we? We think they're the ones who should have the most fulfilling lives. And yet, look at the love and marriage lives of celebrities. I'm shocked now. I used to be shocked when celebrities would get divorced. Now I'm shocked when they don't. If celebrities have marriages that last more than 10 years, to me, I think, wow, that's actually a long marriage. It's very rare in our day and age for celebrities to be married only once, till death do us part, the vows that we say at marriage. I think that may be a sign of the broken nature of the message our culture tells us, that sexual liberty and freedom is the road to fulfillment. See, marriage has to be about more than just us, because the way that we're doing it today, it's not working. The way that we make marriage about us and our own love and fulfillment, it's simply not working. God had to design a marriage, and it was for more than just us. The sacredness of sex and marriage was that God cares about it more than we do, because in establishing marriage, he established a picture, a drama, a shadow of what God was doing in creation and history, in revealing to us his plan of redemption in Christ. This is something that Paul reveals to us in Ephesians chapter 5 when he talks about marriage. He says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound." And we could stop there and say, well, yeah, marriage is profound mystery, because how do men and women get along in marriage for as long as they do? It's a mystery. But Paul continues on. He says, it's profound because I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church. The mystery of marriage was that inherent in the covenants, the commitments, the pursuing of one another, the forgiveness, the recommitting, the continual love, the barriers that have to be overcome in marriage to stay together, that's a picture of the radical commitment God would have for his people in Christ. Marriage is a shadow and revealing of the saving and fulfilling work of Christ. This is our last point, because where we fail to uphold the laws of lust, sex, and marriage, Jesus, he upholds them. See, if marriage points to Christ in the church, if even sex itself is a revealing of what God was going to do in pursuing the church in the work of Christ, then we get a picture there of what Jesus does in the midst of our own brokenness in sexual sin. Jesus had eyes only for his beloved whom he redeemed in his death, even when we fail and turn our eyes on someone else. Jesus remains faithful even when his spouse, the church, is unfaithful. Jesus holds out his commitment to his bride even when we don't, and even when we are undeserving. See, Jesus, he has the ability to bring all healing and wholeness in all of our sexual brokenness because he holds out commitment, steadfast love, mercy, abounding in hope to those who call upon him. So that all of us who come to him, regardless of our sexual histories, our pasts, our marital histories, wherever we may find ourselves in Jesus' commands or warnings, there's a continual holding out of hope. I think this is the intent of the Sermon on the Mount. It's to show that the righteousness of the Pharisees was not enough, and in fact, it will never be enough. The only way to obtain the righteousness beyond the Pharisees is righteousness in Christ. And that righteousness is extended to all who have a long history of struggling with lust or sin, to those who are in the midst of a battle with sexual sin and temptation right now, to those who have a history of fighting sexual sin and brokenness or abuse even, to those who may feel ashamed of their past divorce or marital failures, or maybe those who simply struggle to see the beauty and health of a marriage because of what they grew up with. So wherever we find ourselves, Jesus' healing and wholeness, his saving and fulfillment gives us this offer of salvation, of grace, wherever we come from, that we are now covered in Christ's righteousness and we're welcomed to be part of his kingdom because we don't have a righteousness of our own in this area. Because if we're honest, we won't ever be perfect in fighting against temptation of lust and sexual sin. For some of us, we may go to the grave never having found victory over this in our lives. Our hope is not in our ability to fight and overcome it in our own willpower. Our hope is in the fact that Jesus already covers us in his righteousness and what he has done. And our hope is that Jesus now gives us a new order and way of life to live, even in the midst of our sexual sin. As much as we may not be able to fulfill Jesus' laws perfectly, if Jesus is the fulfillment of them, then we do have a new way of living. There's a new standard that we should desire to live for, even if we can't always uphold it and fulfill it. Jesus gives us the means of pursuing purity and holiness in our sexuality, so that when we pursue Jesus, the answer is not to just grit harder, say, I'll do better, I'll try again better next time, I'll try to go longer without lusting, but rather to truly live the blessed life by resting in what Christ has done, and to live in the freedom that Jesus bought for us. See, Jesus, when he sets us free from sin, he sets us free from sin so that we can live in freedom from pursuing sin. So we can live free from the shameful and condemning nature of sin. So that when we do fail and sin again, sin does not have a hold on us, but Christ's righteousness and grace reigns and frees us out of it to pursue him and his desires and the things of his kingdom again. I think C.S. Lewis, he puts it one of the best ways. He poses this question. He says, we may sometimes feel like our desires are so strong. We have these strong desires for the world, for fame, for greed, for lust, for sex. And he says the problem is not the desires are so strong that Jesus can't overcome them. He says the problem is that our desires are actually too little because we are pursuing the shadow of what's to come. The shadow being the shadow of marriage and sex as a shadow of what's to come in Christ and his church. And so Jesus, in our redemption, gives us new desires, ones that won't fade, new desires for his kingdom, and to live in pursuing him and his kingdom. You know, there's been a lot of talk of revival in recent years. A lot of talk of revival in our culture that needs a renewal of the gospel, especially in our city of San Francisco. There's even talk of revival right now going on. I don't know if you guys are aware of the revival happening at Asbury College and Seminary over in Kentucky. And as people have been reflecting on this idea of revival, something I keep coming back to is the fact that revival often happens when the people of God are renewed in their commitment to Christ and his kingdom. So that as we live to proclaim the gospel, we do so having already being renewed in the gospel ourselves, being renewed as salt and light, committing ourselves for Christ and his kingdom. And you know, I honestly think maybe one of the reasons that revival or renewal doesn't happen is because we are still holding on to our sexual desires and sin in this world. Because of how pervasive sexual sin and temptation has become, I believe this may be one of the main strongholds and areas that Jesus wants to renew his people, his church, to really see revival happen. See, again, friends, the point is not to keep you from doing the things you want to do. Christianity has a bad rap for that. Christianity is all about laws and preventing us from doing the things we want to do. Well, Jesus just doesn't want me to have pleasure and fulfillment sexually. No, Jesus wants far more for you and for us than that. Jesus wants for us to taste and see just how good he is so that all else fades and that as he renews us in the gospel, in the love of Christ, we will see that there really is nothing better than committing ourselves to and pursuing Christ and his kingdom. Only then, brothers and sisters, will I believe we will see revival and renewal happen in our city. When we recommit ourselves, renew ourselves in Christ, remember what he's done for us, and live in the freedom from sin rather than pursuing it, and seeing just how good Christ and his kingdom are. Let's pray together.